borne by conflict participants, but in a world that is as interconnected as ours, fragility and conflicts also have international spillovers that reach countries far and wide. For example, the rise in global prices for food, fuel, and fertilizer has had cascading effects on global growth and inflation prospects, not to mention the potential impacts on social stability in lower income countries. At the IMF, we have been intensifying our efforts to support fragile and conflict afflicted states, including through the adoption of a new tailored strategy this past March. For more on the fund's role in these countries, let's now turn to the welcoming remarks from our Deputy Managing Director, Antoinette Saillet.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. A very good morning or good afternoon to all, depending on where you are joining from. It is my true pleasure to welcome you to this conference on fragility, conflict, and macroeconomic policy in a shock-prone world. This event hopes to bring together cutting-edge research and experienced policymaking to serve the needs of the world's most vulnerable countries. As we hear every day, we are gathered at a time when the global fragility landscape has been worsening. Violence and conflict levels are at a 30-year high. The number of forcibly displaced people has increased to about 90 million. These trends, together with recent shocks, hit fragile and conflict-affected states, or FCS as we call them, the most. One sobering example of this is that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to divergent recoveries. Per capita incomes in FCS are projected to return to pre-pandemic levels only after 2024, much later than for other countries. Economic spillovers from the war have further exacerbated the situation. Sharply higher prices for food and fertilizers are putting significant pressure on households, while higher energy prices are increasing import bills. These shocks are, of course, worsening external and fiscal balances across the world, but they can also contribute to social unrest, particularly in fragile states. The fund has a long-standing engagement with this group of countries. Since 2010, we have provided financing to 28 FCS, totaling $20 billion. Nearly a third of all our capacity development efforts over the last 5 years were directed at these countries. And since the start of the pandemic, 29 fragile states have received financing of nearly $8 billion. FCS also benefited from $16 billion in last year's SDR allocation. Together with the World Bank and others, we supported efforts to address unsustainable debt situations. We are also working together to tackle rising food insecurity and help close financing gaps. These efforts have helped countries meet their immediate balance of payments needs and provide critical health, social, and economic support to the population. Let me add that since most fragile states are also vulnerable to climate risk, they should benefit from our newly approved Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which will provide longer-term financing to address structural challenges such as climate change and pandemics. But we want to do more to support FCS. So we have developed a new strategy to bolster our engagement with this important part of our membership. My colleagues will discuss the strategy with you in detail, but I want to highlight one important aspect. In addition to feedback from country authorities, it has benefited from wide-ranging consultations with 55 other organizations encompassing the World Bank, the UN system, and civil society organizations. We are truly grateful to our partners for their support in developing this strategy. As we step up our efforts, we are also aware of the significant challenges before us. Exiting fragility can take decades, and progress is prone to high risk and recurrent setbacks. And macroeconomic policy, which is what the IMF focuses on, is only one out of many aspects to help countries move from fragility and towards resilience. Often, development, humanitarian, and peace actors will play a predominant role. And this is why our conference is so important. Your views, your experience, and your questions truly matter to us at the Fund. As we would have seen from the agenda, the conference is structured in two parts. Today's sessions will focus on the insights and lessons learned and discussed in the book Macroeconomic Policy in Fragile States, which has been coordinated by IMF staff with contributions from leading academics and practitioners. We are truly grateful to our partners, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, for making this timely and invaluable research possible. Tomorrow's sessions will be dedicated to the IMF's renewed efforts to support fragile states, including its new strategy that will allow us to deliver more tailored, robust, and longer-term support to our most vulnerable members. We will hear the perspectives of country officials, partners, and IMF staff who have been working and leading this effort. I very much look forward to learning of the rich conversation. Thank you once again, and back to you, Pierre-Olivier.
Let's turn now to our session. The volume we are discussing includes contributions from 50 leading experts from a variety of institutions, as well as from academia. 4 contributors to the volume are joining us in this panel discussion. Rafael Espinosa, who is Deputy Division Chief at the IMF and one of the co-editors of the book. Jim Robinson is Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago and the Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts. He's the co-author with Daron Acemoglu of several well-known books, in particular, Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. Ibrahim El-Badawi is the Managing Director of the Economic Research Forum. Previously, he was Minister of Finance and Economy of Sudan. Ralph Shami is Assistant Director of the IMF and is one of the co-editors of the book Macroeconomic Policy in Fragile States. He has overseen fund programs and surveillance work in several fragile countries, including Libya, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen. Now, I'm going to start with the first question to Rafael, but I want to remind our audience that you can put your questions also in the WebEx chat if you're following this on WebEx or in any platform that you're using. So, Rafael, let's start with you. Why a book on macroeconomic policy in fragile states? Can you give us a quick overview of what it brings for those interested in macro issues, but also for the global community of experts working on fragile states?
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. This conference allowed us to present an extensive research program that involved 50 contributors from academia, from international organizations, and think tanks, and also policymakers. The study of state fragility and conflict is multidisciplinary in nature. It involves history, political science, international development, economics, and the objective of this research agenda has been to bring lessons from these fields to macroeconomics. To do so, we have asked experts of state fragility and conflict to think about how macroeconomics fit into the understanding of the mechanism of fragility. And we also have asked, in the other direction, macroeconomists, including those who have experience working on fragile states, to write about how they saw the dynamics of fragility affecting conflict and the macroeconomy. So that process brought us 20 chapters, and several of them focus on the interactions between the political science theories of fragility and macroeconomic policy making. A second set of chapters cover the economic environment, especially for the private sector in fragile states. A third section of the book discusses specifically macroeconomic policies, which are at the heart of the IMF mandate, and that means including fiscal policy, monetary policy, central banking, policies focused on the exchange rates and on managing external flows. And the last section of the volume focuses on the role of the IMF in fragile states, concluding also by presenting case studies from the Middle East and from sub-Saharan Africa. So let me take a few minutes to explain what the research said about why fragile states are different from other countries and what challenges does fragility pose for policymakers? Fragile states, like other developing countries, tend to be stuck in a poverty trap. And this trap originates from a vicious circle between the low income and the different obstacles to growth. For instance, poor households cannot save enough to invest. Small firms cannot overcome fixed cost of operation to become more competitive in world markets. They also become more vulnerable because they are small to shocks and cannot afford to build buffers. So all these characteristics make poor countries more likely to stay poor. Now we know about that, and traditional macroeconomic policies have aimed at addressing this poverty trap. For instance, by increasing foreign finance to increase investment, or by promoting trade liberalization to allow firms to access larger markets and countries to diversify. But countries can also suffer from a second trap, which is called the fragility trap. And this second trap exists because state capacity and state legitimacy are not exogenous factors. They are endogenous characteristics of the country. And they depend on, but also affect, and that's why it's a vicious circle, the delivery of public services, the civic culture, the accountability mechanisms. To give one important and simple example of such a vicious circle, if a state has low tax revenues, it will not be able to deliver public goods. But the population will therefore not want to pay taxes if they don't see the benefits in terms of public goods. So what makes state fragility such a challenge for economic policy making is that these two traps also mutually reinforce each other. For instance, the incentives to mobilize violence are larger when people are poor, and therefore poverty will reinforce the fragility trap. Similarly, poor people cannot afford to pay taxes and may not value some of the public goods. And that will make the state less effective and less legitimate. Looking in the other direction, fewer and less equitable access to public goods makes it more difficult to exit the poverty trap. One chapter written by our colleagues from the World Bank shows that in fragile states, more than in other countries at similar levels of development, firms have to invest themselves on security services. They also have to purchase their own electricity generators because they cannot rely on the public sector to deliver these basic public goods. So the edited volume has more substantial evidence on all these linkages between the fragility trap and the poverty trap. And as you can imagine, facing two interlocking vicious circles is really challenging. The dynamics of one trap affect the initial conditions of the other trap. Different countries will also suffer in different ways. It's often said in this literature that every fragile state is fragile in its own way. So many chapters emphasize that policy making cannot rely on simple recipes. Rather, the contributors to this volume have often provided general principles that can guide policy making, illustrated with good examples of policies that have strengthened state capacity and legitimacy. So I'm sure the panel here with me will be a good occasion to discuss these principles and good examples. Thank you, Pierre-Olivier.
Well, thank you, Raphael. I think this is really a fascinating opening here for this session. Let me follow up with a question for Jim Robinson. So, Jim, in your recent work, and also in the book chapter that you have in this edited volume, you emphasize the need to achieve some balance between the strength of the state and the strength of society in order to escape fragility. Can you explain exactly what you mean and maybe give a few concrete examples where there was a shift in this balance? And what do you see as the role of the international community, especially the community focused on economic institutions, in fostering this balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you could think about our chapter or the framework that we have in our book, The Narrow Corridor, is a way of thinking about how societies can exit from fragility. You know, how do you build institutions? How do you address these problems of legitimacy or state capacity that Raphael was just talking about? You know, so the way we think about that is there's a kind of critical articulation, this kind of critical relationship between the power of the state or the capacity of the state and you could say the power of society, how society is organized collectively, and building state capacity or exiting these sort of fragility traps is not just a technocratic exercise, it's a kind of political exercise. And you have to build state institutions and state capabilities, but society has to move along with that at the same time. Otherwise, the state won't act in the interests of society or act in the collective interest. So, and as you build the state, you have to build the society as well. I think, that equilibrium, that balance, that's challenged by many things you see in the modern world. Think about all the development of technology. Think about the Chinese social credit system. The Chinese social credit system is a kind of Orwellian nightmare. But when George Orwell wrote about how Big Brother is watching you, it actually wasn't technologically possible for Big Brother to watch you. But now it is, and that's a consequence of modern technology. So that's an example of modern technology massively strengthening the capacity of the state relative to society, and that traps China further and further from inclusive institutions. So I think what one has to do is to find sort of culturally relevant and creative ways of building the power of society along with the state. A great example would be trial by jury. Think about a jury. What's a jury? Why do we have juries or trial by jury? That's so that people are involved in the rule of law. So the state can't just arbitrarily enforce laws that people don't think are legitimate or fair. People are involved, and people can veto that. I think that's a great example of how there's a complementarity between the state and the society. So what we describe in our book is just different examples of how you can get this interaction, this kind of dynamic going. It's a process we call the Red Queen effect in the book, where societies and states kind of build each other and interact in a dynamic way. And we suggest different examples of how different types of perturbations or interventions can trigger that dynamic. What can international institutions do? I think that's always complicated because this is something that has to be legitimate within the context of a particular society. But I think outsiders can do a lot. Many of these fragile equilibria, for example, are extremely difficult internally to change. Think about a trade union. When does a firm unionize? When does a firm like Amazon unionize, or the University of Chicago? The rule of thumb is that, or the stylized wisdom is that it's very unusual for a firm or a plant to spontaneously unionize. It comes from outside. The thing that precipitates it comes from outside. Union activists come from outside, and that kind of breaks the collective action problem. So there's an example of outsiders need to come to disrupt the equilibrium. Think about the civil rights movement in the United States. The civil rights movement, yes, it was the initiative of discriminated people of African American fighting against the system. But there was an enormous help and assistance from outsiders, who'd come to the South to help registering voters, to help fighting against the pernicious policies. So I think that's another great example of how outsiders can help. I think probably the problem is that we don't think of it like that. We don't think of intervening in these societies in the right way. We don't think about intervening in a way which can strengthen society, or which can facilitate this dynamic, get this dynamic between state and society, this Red Queen effect going. So I think that needs some kind of pretty radical rethinking of the way outsiders interact with particular societies, and what type of strategies will help build institutions and exit fragility.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I've been told that you have to leave us a little bit ahead of schedule, and so maybe I would bounce back and immediately ask you a sort of a follow-up question before turning to Ibrahim and to Ralph. I can't help but think, you use the example of China, and then, at the same time, when we think about the economic performance of China over the last, let's say, 30 years, one would be maybe hard pressed to think of China as a failed state, even if there is an imbalance between the level of technocratic control of the government and the state of the society. And so, I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And also, is there a sense in which, when you talk about foreign interventions and the need for disrupting the equilibrium, and we've had examples where this can also pretty seriously backfire. I mean, a lot of people would say, for instance, that recent episodes where populations would try sort of gain more independence from a state that was oppressing them, one can think about the Arab Spring, ended up being somewhat disappointing in the end. So how do you look at these two sides?
Oh, I mean, I think that's very straightforward. I think there's many experiences in world history, as we discuss in Why Nations Fail, where you've had quite, long periods of economic growth with with extractive political institutions. So what China has experienced is what we call extractive growth. It's the movement towards much more inclusive economic institutions. That's what created the boom. That's what's created all this economic dynamism. But still under the hegemony of the Communist Party and extractive political institutions. And, I think the world history is very clear on this. You cannot have sustained prosperity in a situation like that. It's an unstable combination. There's no way you can keep an inclusive economy at the whim of an autocracy. So that's just not sustained. The Chinese economic growth is no more sustainable than Argentine economic growth was before the First World War, or Soviet economic growth was up until the 1970s, or whatever example you want to name. So I think I don't know how that will come off the rails, but think about Jack Ma. Jack Ma mildly criticizes the government and then he disappears from sight. Like that, you can't have a modern economy based on institutions like that. It's end of story. So I think that's pretty clear. The Arab Spring, I mean, I think that, that shows how difficult it is, how difficult it is to struggle for inclusive institutions. I think if you look at history, in this country, the United States is struggling to maintain its inclusive institutions at the moment. In any extractive society, there's always huge incentives to keep it extractive. Many people have interests in that. And yeah, people can fight against it, like in Sudan, the work that Ibrahim has been doing in Sudan, all credit to him and his collaborators trying to make that into a different society. That is difficult because there's so many vested interests in the status quo, and there's just so many challenges reconciling all the forces that naturally emerge when you move in a more inclusive direction, and that they're struggling with that in Tunisia. But that, there's no substitute for that. That's how you have to struggle. One of the nice things I think one of the nicest things about the narrow corridor relative to our previous work is that it emphasizes this is a process. It's a process, and often the process is 2 steps forward, 1.9 steps backwards. But there's no substitute for that process.
Well, thank you, Jim. And let me turn it to Ibrahim Al-Badawi immediately. I mean, Ibrahim, in your chapter with Raimundo Soto and Isaac Martinez, you wrote about the constraints that policymakers face when they have to reconcile different constituencies and try to sort of maybe walk that narrow path. And as an experienced macroeconomics yourself, you were also Minister of Finance. You must have lived these political economy constraints very directly. Can you explain how you approached them, and what were the circumstances that made such constraints easier or harder to navigate?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is really a very important question for both an academic as well as a policy perspective. Maybe briefly starting by saying that Raimundo Soto and Isaac Martinez, my two co-authors, and I, we stress the importance of comparative exchange rate regimes for export promotion and growth. But then we also realize the symbiotic cause and effect relationship between fragility and especially political economy and macroeconomic reforms and growth strategies. And I faced this as a finance minister in the case of Sudan, whereby a revolution or a popular uprising back in December 2018 toppled a kleptocratic long-reigning regime that really ran down the country and substantially destroyed the livelihood of the population. So we were faced with a very dire economic situation. For example, Sudan was impacted by, huge debt stock, more than 260%, and a dysfunctional relationship with the international development community, a fiscal effort of only 7% or less, which is way below the threshold specified, for example, by the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF as a fragility threshold, as one of the measures of fragility. The imports is more than twice the export proceeds, rampant parallel market, and the parallel market rate for the exchange rate is more than twice the official rate. And then very significantly, the commodity subsidies, especially petroleum and energy subsidies, account for more than a third of the budget. So the first order of business for us as a transitional government, and particularly myself as a finance minister, was to deal with the macroeconomy. And so we came up with a strategy and a communication strategy as well. And the strategy basically was based on that we have to rein on the subsidies and we have to reform the exchange rate as an immediate tasks to motivate more deeper economic reforms in terms of financial sector restructuring and fiscal reform and civil service reform and the like. However, we had to deal with some very serious challenges associated with the fragility of the situation. It's not only fragility, but also conflict and heritage of kleptocracy, a long-reigning kleptocracy of almost 30 years, or actually 30 years. So there were high expectations, especially by the youth, who were the workforce and continue to be the workforce of the social mobilization and the popular uprising, and the difficulty to appreciate the gravity of the macro situations. People usually think sectoral. And then, of course, the long isolation have also affected the quality of the national debate. And then thirdly, the entrenched interest, especially of the military and security establishment. So the strategy and the communication approach that we took was that we are not lifting subsidies. In fact, we are graduating from subsidizing commodities to directly empowering Sudanese people. And there were two innovative programs that we used, is to actually significantly increase the salary and pay scale for the public sector employees. And in this sense, I think we were aided by the situation of fragility. This is one rare positive aspect, which is that the mismanagement of the economy and the allocation of resources created a condition whereby the public sector employees were substantially deprived. The share to GDP was less than 4%. And so this made it easy for us actually to increase the allocation, approaching the average for or the median for Africa and the Middle East, which is ranging between 5 to 6 to 8%. And we also introduced a cash transfer family support program using digital transfers using mobile money. This allows us to breach a futuristic kind of model using digital technology and empowering the poor population. And then, of course, all of this was being couched as, truly couched actually, as a national agenda supported by the international community that would allow us to extricate ourselves from a deep ditch of debts of $60 billion. That's what I used to say. And then, of course, to rehabilitate the Sudan back into the international community. So I should say that actually this has been a successful strategy, even though it took some time for the population to absorb and to appreciate the importance of the strategy. And finally, in conclusion, I would really like to thank the IMF for the initiative of the book and the research, and recognizing the importance of fragility affecting more than 1 billion people and spanning more than 40 countries. And with this research, and more importantly, the FCS strategy, which actually which hinges on three pillars: tailoring, diagnostics, surveillance, and operational activities on the context of fragility, and especially drawing the linkages between political economy and macro stabilization program and the design of macro stabilization program. And then the second pillar is field presence. I am a former World Bank staff, which is a similar environment to the IMF. The best economists and other professionals like to work in non-fragile countries, obviously. Availability of data and quality of the dialogue and so on. So I think the emphasis on, kind of sufficient, robust presence in fragile states is very important. And then the third pillar of the strategy is the deeper partnership and engagement with a wide range of stakeholders in the countries in question. I think these are very important developments, and which I would highly appreciate. And I think it actually mainstream and support initiatives such as the one that I had to take as a finance minister there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. It's a fascinating account, and it's particularly interesting how you describe how, within these two interlocking traps that Rafael was describing earlier, you managed to find something that could become sort of a self-reinforcing loop going in the right direction by arranging for these efficiency gains by promoting public sector employees who could then sort of help rebuild the institutional capacity of the country. So this is really a fascinating account. Let me turn to Ralph Chamin. Ralph, the volume you co-edited presents some key policy principles. I mean, as Rafael explained, it's not about finding a golden bullet or a magic recipe that will work for all countries in all times. And Jim also mentioned that it requires trying and trying again, and failing and then succeeding finally. And could you explain in more detail some of these principles you think have been most useful in your experience as an IMF mission chief to fragile states?
Yeah, thank you, Pierre-Olivier. In fact, I'm glad that I came, in the last sort of in the discussion, because many of the things I wanted to say have been already introduced. The book actually reflects the work that many of us in the field did in fragile situations, or in countries that are facing fragile situations. The first thing that you realize as a mission chief is, let me take a line out of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Says, all happy families look alike, and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And that's how it applies in fragile states. We say fragile states, but the circumstances of each state is particular to it. And you would do yourself a favor and the country a favor as a mission chief to understand how and why the fragility arises in this particular case. What that means is that there's no one size that fits all. The policy has to be tailored, and the policy and sort of the understanding what brought the fragility, and then designing the policy, the feasible policy, I shouldn't say optimal policy, that would help the country either transition out of fragility or meet the situation that is transpiring on the ground. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I learned as a mission chief, and you find it also in the book, is the idea of we need patient and sustained engagement in those states. The reason is sustained and patient is because what does fragility mean is that in many of those countries there's quite a level of uncertainty, policy reversals. People that you meet and you come back a week, 2 weeks later, the same people that you've been having conversations and discussions aren't there anymore. So you find yourself having to repeat the same message again and again and again. And you end up, as the mission chief, being the liaison between the past and the present and the future, because you end up being the repository of information of what transpired before, during, and after. So having this sustained presence, as Brahim was saying, being present on the ground and understanding the situation creates also a level of trust, which is very much needed in these fragile situations, that the authorities and your own team understand, have trust among them, among the team, and between the team and the authorities. The third lesson also is to give advice in context and when context is there. it's not enough to come in and basically proselytize. You need to understand, is there context for the advice? If you give advice where the context is absent, actually we have a chapter in the book where we work out that if advice is given as a cookie cutter advice, you can actually increase the fragility, if not precipitate in failure. So understanding, is there a context for your advice? And sometimes that context is not there. So the countries have their own timing, have their own dynamics, and you as a mission chief have to understand when to give the advice and how to couch it in a way that reflects the situation on the ground. So we call that giving in context. We have another chapter in the book by Paul Collier talks about a pivotal moment. That's when a situation of social learning has arrived in the country where now your advice may be heeded, may be understood, and may be acted upon. The fourth lesson that I learned is that something that my mom used to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Sometimes you wish you had all the tools that you need in order to do what you need to do. And so you're operating, let's say, from a first best, whereas what's in front of you on the ground is what's available. And you have to make do with what exists already on the ground. It may not be something that's familiar to you at first, but it's working, and if it's working, you should use it. If it's talent, if it's institutions that are performing functions similar to what you thought other institutions ought to be doing, you should make most use of it. We also have a chapter by Warren Coates on the experiences in fragile situations. And the fifth lesson is, I'll steal the line from the Beatles. I get by with little help from my friends. I should say I'll try to do my best with little help from my friends. We cannot do this alone. The IMF, works with the World Bank, should be working and is working with other IFIs, CSOs, other stakeholders, because we need to work together. My experience was, when I was on the ground, is you'd see a lot of institutions on the ground that conducting their own business. And the problem with that is that the capacity in many of these countries is skin deep. So when you have many institutions on the ground asking to be engaged, those people are very few and they're very busy. So we end up, I'm afraid, sometimes wasting their time. There's too much advice being given to too few people. So we need to work together in order to build up that capacity, and that means working together also means that we agree on a common strategy as to how to deal with the situation on the ground. Now, having said all of these 5 principles, I'm very happy to know that Frank and his colleagues, many of these principles are now in the new strategy, Fragile State Strategy, that is, that's, I believe, is going to be discussed in next day of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. And now let me start and open maybe the Q&A part of this first session. And I'm looking at the questions that came through the WebEx platform here. There's a question on the role of external factors in actually maybe destabilizing or contributing to creating a situation of a fragile state. And so there's in particular, there's the narrow corridor, and maybe I will start with Jim, since he has to leave us very soon. But I'll address the question to also all of you. To what extent do you view external factors as contributing to maybe fragilizing states and needing to be overcome as well, or maybe is that part of the narrow corridor approach? Jim, let me start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Then I unfortunately I have to go. Yeah, I mean, I think you can think of examples of that. People have argued. Jeffrey Herbst, for example, the political scientist, has argued that structural adjustment policies destabilized states in Africa. That essentially, the International Monetary Fund and institutions like it came along and said, "Oh, you have all this patronage, and there's overemployment in the civil service, and you have to downsize the state." But those patronage that was patronage, but it was mechanisms for buying social support or redistributing, and then, the case that Herbst looked at in Sierra Leone and Liberia, he argued that, this kind of downsizing of the state, which was forced on the government by international actors, destabilize this particular political equilibrium and help facilitate the civil war. I don't actually believe that. I've worked a lot in Sierra Leone, so I don't actually believe that the specificities of that argument in the case of Sierra Leone. But I think one can imagine that, and just to echo what Ralph says is that, you have to think through what the kind of broader consequences of particular types of policies that, as economists, we may think of them just in terms of the economic fundamentals or how they impact inflation or the budget deficit or whatever. But I think one has to be aware in that situation of institutional fragility that these may be connected to broader institutional equilibria, and one has to think through in a much broader way than perhaps economists usually do, how these things are connected to fragility. Although I think the bottom line is the types of sort of highly unsustainable policies that Ibrahim El-Badawi was talking about is that is a recipe for disaster in any circumstances. So one has to exit from that, but how one does that, I think, is going to be highly tailored to the specificities of the case.
Well, thank you, Jim. Maybe I can ask. I think I can turn actually to Ibrahim or maybe Rafael if you have any additional comments on this point about the role of external factors in and not necessarily the fund. Of course, I don't want to put too much of the pressure here on our own institution, but just more generally, what kind of external factors might be contributing to situations of fragility?
Maybe I can come in, and it's actually an example from James' chapter. I think the story of how industrialists in South Africa realized that they would benefit from an educated labor force because there was a capacity to produce manufacturing, and so the equilibrium between the different fractions of society was changing as the rate of return on qualified labor was becoming really interesting also for the owners of the big industries. So these kind of technological factors that will affect the inequalities and also the realization that we are in it together in the country to succeed. I think these are kind of economic factors that may be global that will affect the incentives to extract resources and therefore to have a more conflictual societies versus to work together. So I think these kind of factors could be really important, and they are unfortunately outside of the scope of what each country can do. But when the opportunity comes in, that's when the leaders also should take it when it comes.
Thank you, Rafael. Ralph and Ibrahim, any particular comments on this point, or
yeah,
a few other questions I can ask?
My 2 cents on this is when you're working on a country, you should always think in terms of a portfolio. You should know the geography very well and the geopolitical situation in which you're operating. This is not an exercise in vacuum. You have to understand what are the external factors surrounding the country that you are operating in, and that determines to a great extent the success or failure of any given program or intervention or interaction with the country. So, and you would not be doing your country a favor or yourself if you do not understand or pay quite a bit of attention to what are the geopolitics or geopolitical, or what is the geopolitical situation in the area where you're operating. That is how I interpret external factors beyond just the economics itself.
Thanks, Ralph. And so let me bring another question now. Maybe Ibrahim, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to say that just to agree with the 3 speakers, but I also want to emphasize that what's really destabilizing are politically motivated interventions. I think the international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and so on are actually, to a large extent, a victim of the political kind of geopolitical objectives of some of the major countries that tend to, emphasize short-term political ends, and that kind of suck the international development institutions into a partnership that are not well prepared, and that what causes some sort of reputational risks. But I think increasingly, I should say that the IMF, the World Bank, and in particular, they have actually learned and fashioned their approaches, especially, for example, like this FCS strategy, is to actually work with the grassroots and to try to develop goodwill and better understanding with the stakeholders, not just the government.
Thank you, Ibrahim. So let me now bring up another question that was coming from the audience. So, I mean, if we think, I was really struck by what Ibrahim described, and you have this powerful self-reinforcing traps, the poverty trap and the institutional trap, and in how do you break that? How do you break this? This self-reinforcing cycle of fragility and poverty traps, and are there any particular entry points that are sort of good points for interventions, maybe not working all the time and in all places, but that history tells us are good places where we want to come in? And are these entry points, if there are such entry points, well suited to be used by institutions like the fund, trying to catalyze a virtuous cycle as opposed to a destructive cycle? Who would like to take such a broad question?
Let me try it. I believe Paul Collier does a very nice job in the book talking about a pivotal moment. Basically, his premise is when does intervention or interaction with a country in a fragile situation really works? It works when there's a certain level of social learning, or you reach a point where internally, endogenously, there's a recognition that situation cannot continue. The baseline scenario is not sustainable. So if you're coming from the outside and wanting to help, it's not only for you to realize that it has to be on the ground, has to be understood by those that are in charge, that we need to break with the past. Only then can you break away from the fragility, because Paul calls it the pivotal moment. And that pivotal moment is a recognition of the mistakes that were done in the past, and basically an atonement, and then a plan of action as to how to move forward, and with quick wins. Because quick wins that, if we have time, I can get into more examples, quick wins that are given a lot of attention, and using communication strategy and outreach to basically galvanize the population around it and give it recognition. And he uses the theory of scaffolding so that you basically reach from one success to the other, giving it a lot of attention and gaining with it trust, gaining momentum, and gaining traction internally and externally, and basically moving towards an exit strategy.
Thank you, Ralph.
I think
Rafael, any comments?
If I could say something here from the perspective, from a perspective of Sudan being a highly socially mobilized society in their need for reform, I think it's very important to actually, obviously develop a national narrative that is convincing and accessible to the public. But then also it's very important to focus on specific segments of the society, such as the youth and the women, and just to get them on board in terms of the issues that they care about. Like, for example, we tried at the government to tell to toe the line that commodity subsidies are inimical to the future, and that when you have subsidy that accounts for more than the public expenditure in education and health and social protection, then we are mortgaging the future of our young people. And so these kind of national narratives that actually capture the imagination of a dynamic segment of the society, I think would be very important to emphasize at the beginning of the reform.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Let me focus a little bit on the policies and the instruments. There are a couple of questions here in from the audience, they're asking, well, does it mean that in practice, I mean, we understand it's not going to be cookie cutter, so we have to take into account the specificities of the countries, their history, their geopolitical considerations, the way their institutions are shaped. But does it mean in practice that an institution like the fund, for instance, is to be very more open to, let's say, unorthodox policies, or are there particular types of, let's say, macro fiscal instruments that should be more relevant for FCS uh, um, than for a typical emerging market economy, for instance? So, is there a particular lesson in terms of the instruments that we as an institution, and when we're thinking about policies, we should be more willing to sort of promote or implement, or maybe it's going to be more relevant in some situations? And I guess that's a question for all three of you. So I don't know who might want to start. Maybe Raphael, since he hasn't spoken on the previous round.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. Let me start with the fiscal side. Maybe we have a session later today where there will be more details on the kind of fiscal policies that we've been looking at in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF for fragile states. And in broad terms, again, there will be more time in the next session for that. The idea of being able to raise revenues initially relatively quickly by looking at key points of entry where the cash is coming in, to be able to raise taxes and start to be in this positive process, a virtuous circle of raising more revenues and then starting to deliver more public services that people will realize are coming in, and therefore increase the legitimacy of the government. So that kind of action on the fiscal side is something that we work a lot at the IMF. The second thing I want to mention is that in general, all policies should take very careful notice of what the impact are going to be on the perception of corruption, the perception of inequality, the perception of legitimacy of the government. To give an example, parallel exchange markets that Ibrahim mentioned is really problematic because it leads to access to foreign currency at much cheaper prices for those who have access to the central bank and to the side auctions. So I think that's a good example of monetary policy and exchange rate policy that can have a very big impact on the legitimacy of the state. We also have in the book some extensive work on capacity development that the IMF is doing to increase capacity of central banks. And in some post-conflict states, it means something as simple as actually delivering banknotes to the country so that people realize, okay, there is a monetary system, there is currency in circulation that can be used for trading. And so, you build from that depending on where the state of fragility and post-conflict is. But these are the kind of instruments we look at carefully in fragile states.
Thank you, Raphael.
If I could take it sort of a bit differently, in fragile states, you need to think about if you can't survive the short term, there's no sense in talking about medium or long term. So you need to understand that you need to help them through the short term part. But what you really want to avoid if you have a short term problem is to put in place long term solutions. Short term problems warrant short term solutions. And there are many examples of a knee-jerk reaction by the people on the ground to implement long-term solutions just to placate a short-term problem. So you find part of your job as a mission chief is to keep them from doing so while helping them to understand how we best to stabilize the situation in the short term. The other thing is, 1 + 1 is 2, no matter what the situation is. But sometimes is understanding the context, as I was mentioning before. For example, Ibrahim mentioned the issue of raising the salaries of the civil service employees. Well, in many cases, in an emerging market where you have the wage bill is a huge percentage of GDP and the fiscal side is hemorrhaging, the typical advice would be is to cut the wage bill. But then you arrive in a fragile state and you realize if you were to do something like that, you could precipitate failure. And in fact, I believe in chapter 8 in the book, we go through that analysis analytically showing that in such situations, you may want to figure out other ways of dealing with the fiscal situation without using the standard approach of sort of just basically saying, well, you need to cut your wage bill and release people into unemployment that's already burgeoning.
Thank you, Ralph. Ibrahim, any views on the instruments that might be most appropriate?
I think this idea of switching from commodity subsidies to to actually increase salaries and benefits from very low level, awkwardly low levels, is a non-traditional approach to saying that while we are concerned about macro imbalances in general, we are also very much concerned about the distribution of the benefits in society in a way that will help a social purpose, such as reinvigorating the civil service and helping shoring up the middle class. So that would be one example. On trade also, for example, marketing boards are not only fixing prices and undermining the capacity of the farmers to gain from their from their exports, but it also stabilizes prices and also complete markets so perhaps maybe when we talk about macroeconomic reform as important and macroeconomic balances are important, we should also say that subject to this very important consideration and necessary for every economic regime, we are kind of open and flexible regarding some other sectoral and trade reforms that actually take into account the idiosyncratic kind of situation in the context of conflicts and fragility.
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. We're coming towards a close here. I just want to say that I've been very impressed by the depth and the amount of the knowledge, knowledge that is displayed in the book and in our opening session this morning. I mean, it's interesting because the macroeconomist would approach a situation of multiple equilibria where you have self-reinforcing vicious cycles, for instance, with this idea that somehow you need to break away, you need to achieve escape velocity, you need to have a big push or something like this. And really, one of the themes that I think we take away from this discussion this morning is you can't do this, and you need to bring society along with the state, with the building capacity. You need to sort of do it much more organically, which of course is much more difficult. But at the same time, really, what I found fascinating is the extent to which by knowing what's happening on the ground, having a level of expertise, being engaged, and having a discussion with all the different stakeholders, we can find this entry points. We can find these entry points where we can build the momentum and gradually, hopefully, eventually get there and be able to overturn this bad dynamics that these countries found themselves in. So anyway, I found this was a fascinating exchange. I want to thank all four our panelists, even if Jim Robinson had to leave us already, but I certainly want to thank Raphael, Ibrahim, and Ralph as well. And thank everyone for attending and listening today. I want to remind you that the second session 2, will start at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and the panelists will discuss how building state capacity can help countries exit the fragility trap. And so with this, I will close now this session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.